I never thought owning a snow plow would land me in small claims court, but here I was, staring down a woman named Brenda who believed the entire world revolved around her cul-de-sac. My name is Vincent Kovak, and I run a small landscaping business in Naperville, Illinois, just outside of Chicago. During the spring and summer, I handle lawn care, garden maintenance, and the occasional hardscaping project. Come winter, I attach a plow to my F-250 and clear driveways and parking lots for commercial clients. It's honest work that pays the bills, and I've built a decent reputation over the past 8 years since I started the business after leaving my corporate job in marketing. The freedom of being my own boss was worth the risk, even if it meant dealing with difficult customers now and then. The trouble started on a freezing Tuesday morning in late January. We had gotten hammered with nearly 14 inches of snow overnight, one of those heavy, wet snowfalls that makes your back ache just looking at it. I had been up since 3 in the morning, plowing the parking lots of my commercial accounts, a few medical office buildings, and a strip mall on Route 59. By 8:30, I was exhausted, my truck's heater blasting to keep me awake as I headed home for a hot shower and maybe a few hours of sleep. I lived in Maple Ridge, a neighborhood of about 200 homes built in the early 2000s, complete with all the amenities that attracted young families and retirees alike. We had a community pool, a small park with a playground, walking paths that connected various sections of the neighborhood, and of course, a homeowners association that loved to remind everyone of its existence through a steady stream of violation notices and community bulletins. The HOA president was Brenda Patterson, a 52-year-old woman with a blonde bob that looked like it required architectural support, and a voice that could shatter glass when she got worked up. She had been president for 6 years, running unopposed each election because nobody else wanted the headache. Brenda took her position seriously, perhaps too seriously, treating every minor infraction like a federal crime and every suggestion like a personal attack on her authority. I was about 3 blocks from my house when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I recognized as Brenda's. I considered letting it go to voicemail, but years of running a business had trained me to answer every call. You never knew when it might be a lucrative opportunity. "Vincent Kovak," I answered, keeping my voice professional despite my exhaustion. "Vincent, this is Brenda Patterson from the HOA board." Her voice was clipped and impatient. "I need to speak with you about an urgent matter." "What can I help you with, Brenda?" "I'm looking out my window right now, and Oakmont Court has not been plowed. Not a single pass. The main roads are clear, but our street is completely impassable. I have a hair appointment at 10, and I cannot get my car out of my driveway." I felt a headache forming behind my eyes. "Brenda, the county is responsible for plowing the neighborhood streets. I only do private driveways and commercial lots." "That's unacceptable," she snapped. "The county hasn't come through yet, and we pay HOA dues specifically for situations like this. You live in this neighborhood, you own a plow, and I'm telling you that Oakmont Court needs to be cleared immediately." "The HOA dues don't cover snow removal," I said slowly, trying to keep my tone even. "That's not in our budget or services. The county will get to it when they can. They're probably overwhelmed right now." "I don't care about the county's schedule. You're going to plow this street, Vincent. You're part of this community, and it's your responsibility to help your neighbors." I pulled into my driveway, my truck rumbling beneath me. Through my windshield, I could see my front door, my warm house, and the promise of rest. "Brenda, I've been working since 3 this morning. I'm not plowing streets for free." "Who said anything about free?" Her voice took on a saccharine quality that set off alarm bells. "Obviously, you would be compensated. The HOA will pay you a fair rate. That caught my attention. I was a businessman after all, and if the HOA wanted to hire me for a job, that was different than Brenda trying to bully me into free labor. What are we talking about here? Just Oakmont Court? For now, yes. If you do a good job, perhaps we can discuss a contract for the whole neighborhood. I did some quick mental math. Oakmont Court was a cul-de-sac with 12 houses, maybe 500 feet of street total. With the plow already on my truck and warmed up, it would take me 30 minutes tops. My commercial rate was $150 an hour, so $75 seemed reasonable for a quick job. I can do it for $75, I said. I'll need payment within 30 days of invoicing. There was a pause on the other end. That seems rather expensive for half an hour of work. That's my rate, Brenda. Take it or leave it. The county will get there eventually. Another pause, longer this time. Fine, do it now, please. I really need to get to my appointment. I'll be there in 10 minutes. I hung up and sat in my truck for a moment, debating whether I should get something in writing first. But Brenda had agreed to my rate over the phone, and I was too tired to drive over to her house and have her sign a contract. Besides, we were neighbors. She was annoying, sure, but she wouldn't stiff me on payment. At least that's what I told myself as I backed out of my driveway and headed toward Oakmont Court. The street was indeed a mess. The snow had piled up in thick drifts, and I could see several cars stuck in driveways, their owners probably having tried and failed to get out that morning. Brenda's house was at the end of the cul-de-sac, a large colonial with gray siding and black shutters. I could see her standing in her front window, watching me like a supervisor on a construction site. I got to work, making smooth passes up and down the street, pushing the heavy snow to the sides. The work was methodical and satisfying in its way. There's something deeply gratifying about transforming a snow-covered obstacle into a clear, passable road. My truck handled the job beautifully, the plow cutting through the accumulation like butter. 28 minutes after I started, Oakmont Court was clear. I gave a friendly wave to a few neighbors who had come out to move their cars or shovel their walkways, then pulled up near Brenda's house. She emerged from her front door, wrapped in a puffy white coat that made her look like the Michelin Man, her face pinched against the cold. I rolled down my window. All done. I'll send you an invoice. It looks adequate, she said, as if she were grading a homework assignment. Send the invoice to the HOA post office box. The address is on the website. Will do. Have a good day, Brenda. She gave me a curt nod and headed to her garage, where her pristine white Lexus SUV waited. I drove home, finally got that shower, and collapsed into bed for 4 glorious hours of sleep. 3 days later, I sent a professional invoice to the HOA post office box, just as Brenda had instructed. The invoice was straightforward. $75 for snow removal services on Oakmont Court, dated with the day and time of service, with payment due within 30 days. I had done thousands of invoices over the years, and this one was no different. I didn't think much about it until the 30-day mark came and went with no payment. I sent a follow-up email to the HOA's general inbox, asking about the status of my payment. No response. I sent another email a week later. Still nothing. By the time 45 days had passed, I was annoyed. $75 wasn't going to break my business, but it was the principle of the thing. Brenda had specifically asked me to plow her street. We had agreed on a price. I had done the work, and now she was ghosting me. I decided to take a more direct approach. On a Saturday afternoon in mid-March, I walked over to Brenda's house and rang the doorbell. She answered wearing yoga pants and a fleece pullover, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. Behind her, I could hear the sound of HGTV playing on what sounded like a very large television. "Vincent," she said, her expression neutral. "What brings you by?" I wanted to follow up on the invoice I sent for plowing Oakmont Court back in January. "I haven't received payment yet." Her expression shifted to one of confusion, as if I had just asked her to explain quantum physics. "What invoice?" "The $75 invoice for snow removal. We discussed it over the phone. I plowed the street, and I sent the invoice to the HOA post office box like you told me to." "Oh, that." She waved her hand dismissively. "The HOA board decided not to pay that." I felt my jaw tighten. "Excuse me. We had a board meeting and we discussed your invoice. The consensus was that since you live in the neighborhood and benefit from having clear streets, you shouldn't charge the HOA for plowing. It's a community service. Besides, $75 for 30 minutes of work is highway robbery." "Brenda, you called me. You asked me to plow the street. We agreed on the price before I did the work. That's a contract." "We did no such thing," she said, her voice taking on that imperious tone I had come to despise. "I asked if you could help the community and you volunteered. There was never any discussion of payment." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She was flat out lying, rewriting history to avoid paying a bill she had agreed to. "That's not what happened. You specifically said the HOA would compensate me at a fair rate." "I think you're misremembering, Vincent. Regardless, the board has made its decision. The invoice will not be paid. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have things to do." She started to close the door, but I put my hand up. "Brenda, I did the work. You owe me payment. Take your hand off my door or I'll call the police for harassment." Her eyes had gone cold. I stepped back, my hand dropping to my side. "This isn't over." "I think it is," she said, and closed the door in my face. I stood on her porch for a moment, breathing deeply to calm myself down. I had dealt with difficult clients before, people who tried to negotiate down bills or delayed payment, but I had never had someone completely deny that we had an agreement. It was infuriating. Walking back to my house, I decided that if Brenda wanted to play hardball, I could play too. I wasn't going to let her cheat me out of $75, not because of the money, but because allowing her to get away with it would set a terrible precedent. If she could bully me into doing free work, she would do it to other people in the neighborhood too. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and started researching small claims court in Illinois. I had never sued anyone before, but the process seemed straightforward enough. For claims under $10,000, you could file in small claims court without a lawyer. The filing fee was relatively small, and the hearing would be scheduled within a few months. All I needed was documentation of the agreement and proof that I had performed the service. The documentation part was trickier than I had hoped. We had made the agreement over the phone, and I hadn't gotten anything in writing beforehand. However, I had sent an invoice immediately after doing the work, and Brenda had acknowledged the invoice by telling me to send it to the HOA post office box. That showed she knew I expected payment. I also had phone records showing that she had called me that morning, which would support my version of events. I spent the next week gathering everything I needed. I pulled phone records from my cellular provider showing Brenda's incoming call on the date in question. I printed out the invoice I had sent, along with the follow-up emails I had sent to the HOA requesting payment. I even drove over to Oakmont Court and took photos of the street, though I wasn't sure how helpful that would be 2 months after the fact. On March 25th, I went to the DuPage County Courthouse in Wheaton and filed a small claims complaint against Brenda Patterson and the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association for breach of contract and unjust enrichment. The filing fee was $68, which I noted with some irony was almost as much as the original debt. But I was committed now. This had become about more than money. The clerk told me that Brenda and the HOA would be served with the complaint within the next 2 weeks, and a hearing would be scheduled approximately 60 days out. I thanked her and left the courthouse feeling a mixture of satisfaction and anxiety. I had taken the first step, but I had no idea how this would play out. Brenda received the complaint about 10 days later, and she was not happy about it. I know this because she showed up at my house at 7 in the morning, pounding on my front door like she was trying to break it down. I had just gotten out of the shower and was barely decent when I answered, a towel wrapped around my waist and water still dripping from my hair. "Are you insane?" she shrieked, waving the complaint papers in my face. "You're suing me. Over $75. "I asked you nicely for payment multiple times," I said calmly. "You refused and claimed we never had an agreement. This is the next logical step. This is harassment. I'm going to file a counter-suit for emotional distress." "That's your right, Brenda. I'll see you in court." "You're going to regret this," she hissed. "I have friends in this neighborhood, Vincent, a lot of friends, and they're going to hear about how you're suing your neighbors over pocket change." "Tell whoever you want," I said. "The facts are on my side." She glared at me for another moment, then turned and stormed back to her car, the complaint papers crumpled in her fist. I closed the door and leaned against it, my heart pounding. I had known she wouldn't take the lawsuit well, but the intensity of her reaction still surprised me. Over the next few weeks, I learned that Brenda had indeed been talking to the neighbors. I started getting cold shoulders from people I had been friendly with for years. Someone left a note on my truck calling me a money-grubbing jerk. At the next HOA meeting, which I attended specifically to see what would happen, Brenda spent 10 minutes of her president's report talking about frivolous lawsuits and neighbors who don't understand community spirit, all while looking directly at me. But not everyone turned against me. My next-door neighbor, Tom Richards, a retired police officer who had lived in Maple Ridge since it was built, stopped by one evening with a 6-pack of beer and some moral support. "I heard about the lawsuit," he said, settling into one of my patio chairs. We were sitting in my backyard enjoying the first warm evening of spring. "Brenda's been bad-mouthing you all over the neighborhood." "Yeah, I've noticed," I said, accepting a beer. "Thanks for this, by the way. Don't mention it. For what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing. Brenda's been getting away with crap like this for years because nobody wants to stand up to her. She treats this HOA like her personal fiefdom." "I just want to get paid for work I did," I said. "It's not complicated." "It never is with people like her," Tom said. "She makes everything complicated because she can't stand being told no. You know she tried to fine me last year because my mailbox was the wrong shade of black." "You're kidding." "Nope. Said it was faded and didn't meet HOA standards." I told her it was the same mailbox I installed in 2004, and she could take her fine and shove it. She backed down, but only because I threatened to run against her in the next election. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, drinking our beers and watching the sun set over the neighborhood. "You think I'll win?" I asked. Tom shrugged. "No idea, but I'll testify if you need me to. I remember that day. I saw you plowing Oakmont Court, and I remember thinking it was nice that the HOA finally did something useful with our dues. I might take you up on that." The court date was set for May 14th, a Thursday morning at 9 o'clock. As the date approached, I found myself getting increasingly nervous. I had never been to court before, except for one speeding ticket when I was 23, and that had been resolved with a fine. This was different. I would have to present evidence, question witnesses potentially, and make legal arguments. The fact that it was small claims court and more informal than a regular trial only helped a little. I decided to consult with a lawyer, even though I wouldn't have one representing me in court. I called a friend from college, Marcus Webb, who practiced contract law at a firm in Chicago. We met for lunch at a diner in Downers Grove, and I laid out the whole situation for him over sandwiches and coffee. "It's a classic he said, she said situation," Marcus said, wiping mustard from his mouth. "You say there was an agreement. She says there wasn't. The question is whether you have enough evidence to prove your version is more credible. I have the phone records showing she called me, the invoice I sent immediately after, and her statement telling me to send it to the HOA post office box." "That's good, especially the last part. If she told you to send an invoice, that implies she expected to be billed. Do you have that in writing?" "No, that was in person." Marcus frowned. "That's tougher but not insurmountable. The timing of the invoice is important. You sent it right after doing the work, which suggests you believed you had an agreement. If there was no agreement, why would you send an invoice?" "Exactly. And she never disputed the invoice when she received it. Not until I asked about payment 45 days later. That helps too. A reasonable person who receives an invoice for work they didn't agree to would dispute it immediately. Her silence could be seen as acknowledgement. What about witnesses? Anyone hear the phone conversation or see what happened?" "My neighbor Tom saw me plowing and assumed the HOA hired me." "I don't know if that helps. It establishes that you were actually there doing the work, which she presumably can't deny. Look, Vincent, I'm not going to lie to you. This could go either way. Small claims judges have a lot of discretion, and they're used to seeing disputes like this. Your strongest argument is unjust enrichment. Even if the judge doesn't think you can prove the contract, you might win on the theory that she received a benefit, the plowing, and it would be unjust for her to keep that benefit without paying for it." "What are my chances?" Marcus shrugged. 50-50. Maybe 60-40 in your favor if you present it well. The judge will look at the circumstances and decide who's more credible. Just be honest, be clear, and don't get emotional, even if Brenda tries to rile you up. She's good at that. I bet she is. People like her usually are. We finished lunch, and Marcus refused to let me pay for his meal or his advice. "Consider it a favor," he said. "Go get her, man. People like that need to be held accountable." The morning of May 14th arrived with clear skies and mild temperatures, the kind of perfect spring day that makes you forget about the brutal winter that preceded it. I put on a suit, something I rarely did anymore, and drove to the courthouse in Wheaton. I arrived 30 minutes early, clutching a folder with all my evidence organized and tabbed. The small claims courtroom was smaller than I expected, with benches for maybe 30 people, and a raised platform where the judge would sit. There was no jury box, no fancy wood paneling like you see on TV. It was functional and plain, which somehow made it more intimidating. Brenda arrived 15 minutes before the hearing, accompanied by a man in an expensive suit who I assumed was a lawyer. When I had filed the case, I had named both Brenda personally and the HOA as defendants, figuring one of them would have to pay if I won. Apparently, the HOA had decided to spring for legal representation. The lawyer was a tall man in his 40s with silver hair and an air of confidence that came from years of courtroom experience. He introduced himself as Richard Dalton and handed me his business card. "Mr. Kovak," he said smoothly, "I represent the Maple Ridge HOA in this matter. I was hoping we might be able to resolve this before the judge comes out. Would you be willing to accept $50 and drop the case?" "No," I said. "The amount owed is $75 plus the $68 filing fee. That's what I'm here for." "Be reasonable, Mr. Kovak." The cost of this hearing alone exceeds the amount in dispute. Take the $50 and we can all go home. I'll take $75 plus the filing fee. Dalton's smile tightened. I'm afraid we can't do that. See you in there. He walked back to where Brenda was sitting, and I saw them conferring in low voices. Brenda kept shooting angry glances in my direction, but I ignored her, focusing instead on reviewing my notes. At exactly 9 o'clock, a bailiff called the courtroom to order, and Judge Margaret Sanderson entered. She was a woman in her early 60s with short gray hair and reading glasses perched on her nose. She settled into her chair, reviewed the case file in front of her, and then looked up at both parties. This is the matter of Kovak versus Patterson and Maple Ridge Homeowners Association, she said. Mr. Kovak, you're representing yourself? Yes, Your Honor, I said, standing up. And Mr. Dalton, you're here for the defendants. That's correct, Your Honor. All right. Mr. Kovak, this is your complaint. Please present your case. I walked to the podium at the center of the courtroom, my folder in hand. I had practiced this part a dozen times, but my mouth still felt dry. Your Honor, on January 28th of this year, the defendant Brenda Patterson called me and requested that I plow Oakmont Court in our neighborhood. We discussed payment, and I quoted her $75 for the job. She agreed, and I performed the work that same morning. I then sent an invoice to the HOA as Mrs. Patterson instructed, but payment was never made. When I followed up, Mrs. Patterson claimed we never had an agreement, which is false. I'm here seeking payment for services rendered, plus my filing fee. Do you have evidence of this agreement? Judge Sanderson asked. I have phone records showing that Mrs. Patterson called me that morning, I said, handing copies to the bailiff, who passed them to the judge. I also have the invoice I sent immediately after completing the work, and email correspondence showing my attempts to collect payment. The judge reviewed the documents, her expression neutral. Mr. Dalton, your response. Dalton stood, buttoning his suit jacket in a practiced motion. Your Honor, there was never any agreement as Mr. Kovak claims. Mrs. Patterson called him that morning to ask if he could assist the community during a snow emergency. Mr. Kovak volunteered to help, as any good neighbor would. The invoice he sent was unexpected and unwelcome. The HOA has no obligation to pay for services it never contracted for. Mrs. Patterson, the judge said, looking at Brenda, please come forward and be sworn in. Brenda walked to the witness stand, placed her hand on a Bible, and swore to tell the truth. She sat down, smoothing her skirt, and looked at the judge with an expression of wounded innocence. Mrs. Patterson, tell me what happened on the morning of January 28th, Judge Sanderson said. Your Honor, we had received a terrible snowstorm overnight, and the county was very slow in plowing our neighborhood streets. I was concerned about elderly residents who might need to get to doctor's appointments or get their medications. I called Mr. Kovak because I knew he had a plow and I thought he might be willing to help the community. He agreed to plow Oakmont Court, and I was very grateful. I never promised to pay him. It was simply neighbors helping neighbors. Did you discuss payment at all during that phone conversation? The judge asked. Absolutely not. The thought never crossed my mind. What about the invoice he sent? I was shocked when I received it. It seemed very opportunistic to demand payment for what I thought was a kind gesture. Did you respond to the invoice? I discussed it with the HOA board, and we decided not to pay it. Did you inform Mr. Kovak of that decision? Brenda hesitated. I may have mentioned it to him at some point. You may have, or you did. I did. Yes. When he came to my house demanding payment. Judge Sanderson made a note on her pad. Mr. Kovak, do you want to question the witness? I stood up, my heart pounding. This was the part I was most nervous about. Mrs. Patterson, you said you called me because you were concerned about elderly residents. Which elderly residents on Oakmont Court needed to get to appointments that morning? Brenda blinked. I don't recall specific names. Were there actually any elderly residents who needed help, or were you concerned about getting to your own hair appointment? Objection, Dalton said. Argumentative. This is small claims court, Mr. Dalton. I'll allow it. Mrs. Patterson, please answer the question. Brenda's face flushed. I did have an appointment that morning, but that's not why I called. But you told me on the phone that you couldn't get your car out of your driveway and you had a hair appointment at 10. Isn't that right? I may have mentioned my appointment. So you called me primarily because you needed to get out, not because of community concern. I was concerned about everyone on the street, but concerned enough about yourself to call me at 8:30 in the morning when you knew I had been working since 3 a.m. I didn't know that. And when I said I wasn't going to plow the street for free, what did you say? I don't recall. You don't recall telling me that the HOA would compensate me at a fair rate. I never said that. Then why did you tell me to send an invoice to the HOA post office box? Brenda paused. I don't believe I said that either. I pulled out another document from my folder. Your Honor, this is an email I sent to the HOA on February 10th asking about the status of my payment. I specifically mentioned in this email that Mrs. Patterson told me to send the invoice to the post office box. If that wasn't true, why didn't she respond to this email and correct me? Judge Sanderson took the email and read it carefully. Mrs. Patterson, did you see this email? The HOA receives many emails. I can't be expected to respond to all of them. But you're the president of the HOA, correct? Yes. And this email was sent to the general HOA inbox. Yes, but we have a secretary who handles most correspondence. Is the secretary here today? No, Your Honor. The judge frowned and made another note. Mr. Kovak, anything else? Just one more question. Mrs. Patterson, if you truly believed I was volunteering my services that morning, why didn't you thank me or show any appreciation? When I finished plowing and came to your house, all you said was that it looked adequate and to send you an invoice. Does that sound like the response to a volunteer? Brenda's mouth opened and closed like a fish. I was in a hurry to get to my appointment. No further questions, I said. Judge Sanderson looked at Dalton. Do you have any witnesses, Mr. Dalton? No, Your Honor. We believe Mrs. Patterson's testimony is sufficient. All right. Does the HOA have any documentation showing that snow removal is not one of its services, or that there was no budget for this expense? Dalton shuffled through his papers. The HOA bylaws don't specifically mention snow removal. So there's no prohibition against the HOA paying for snow removal if it chooses to. No, Your Honor, but the board never authorized this expense. Did the board meet after Mr. Kovak plowed the street but before he sent the invoice? I don't believe so. So when Mrs. Patterson spoke to Mr. Kovak, she was acting as the HOA president with authority to make decisions on behalf of the organization. Within certain limits, yes. Judge Sanderson sat back in her chair, removing her glasses and cleaning them with a cloth. The courtroom was silent except for the ticking of a clock on the wall. Finally, she put her glasses back on and looked at both parties. Here's what I see, she said. Mr. Kovak performed a service that benefited both Mrs. Patterson personally and the residents of Oakmont Court generally. He sent an invoice immediately after performing that service, which suggests he believed there was an agreement to be paid. Mrs. Patterson told him to send the invoice to the HOA, which further suggests she acknowledged an obligation to pay. Her failure to dispute the invoice for 45 days is additional evidence that she knew payment was expected. Your Honor, Dalton began, but the judge held up her hand. I'm not finished, Mr. Dalton. Even if I were to accept Mrs. Patterson's version of events, which I don't entirely, there would still be a claim for unjust enrichment. Mr. Kovak provided a valuable service that Mrs. Patterson and the HOA received the benefit of. It would be unjust to allow them to keep that benefit without payment, particularly when Mr. Kovak is in the business of providing such services and has a reasonable expectation of payment. My heart was racing. Was she about to rule in my favor? The evidence shows that Mrs. Patterson called Mr. Kovak. They discussed his services. He provided those services, and he billed for them in a timely manner. The amount charged, $75, is reasonable for the work performed. I find in favor of the plaintiff, Vincent Kovak, in the amount of $75, plus the $68 filing fee, for a total of $143. Judgment is entered jointly against Brenda Patterson and the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association. The gavel came down with a sharp crack, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I had won. Actually won. Brenda's face had gone red, and she was whispering furiously to Dalton, who looked resigned. The lawyer stood and addressed the judge. Your Honor, we request a stay of 30 days to appeal. Request denied. This is small claims court, Mr. Dalton. You know the rules. Judgment is final. You have 30 days to pay. Another crack of the gavel, and Judge Sanderson stood, gathering her files. Next case. I walked out of the courtroom feeling like I was floating. Tom Richards, who had taken the morning off to come watch the hearing, clapped me on the back. Well done, man. You nailed her. I can't believe it worked, I said. Truth usually does, Tom replied. Now comes the fun part, getting them to actually pay. He was right. Winning the judgment was only half the battle. I still had to collect the money. Under Illinois law, the defendants had 30 days to pay before I could take additional collection actions. I hoped they would just pay and be done with it, but something told me Brenda wasn't going to make it that easy. The 30 days came and went with no payment. I sent a certified letter to both Brenda and the HOA, reminding them of the judgment and demanding payment. The letter was returned signed for, but I received no response. I was going to have to take it to the next level. I went back to the courthouse and filed for a citation to discover assets, which is a legal mechanism that allows you to find out what assets the debtor has so you can collect on your judgment. The court scheduled a hearing and ordered Brenda and a representative of the HOA to appear and answer questions about their finances under oath. This time, Brenda showed up without a lawyer. The HOA had apparently decided not to pay Dalton's hourly rate for a case they had already lost. She sat on the opposite side of the small courtroom, her arms crossed, radiating hostility. When the hearing began, the judge, a different one this time, explained the process. Brenda would have to disclose her bank accounts, income, and other assets so that I could pursue collection. If she refused to cooperate, she could be held in contempt of court under questioning. Brenda reluctantly disclosed that she had 2 bank accounts, a checking and savings at Chase Bank, with a combined balance of about $43,000. She also received a salary of $65,000 a year from her job as an office manager at a dental practice. The HOA had approximately $18,000 in its operating account. So you have the ability to pay the judgment? The judge asked. Yes, Brenda said through gritted teeth. Then I strongly suggest you do so. If Mr. Kovak has to take further collection actions, you'll be liable for those costs as well. This is a small debt that's going to become a large debt if you keep fighting it. After the hearing, I approached Brenda in the hallway. Just pay me, Brenda. This is ridiculous. You've humiliated me in front of the entire neighborhood, she hissed. Everyone knows about this lawsuit now. Do you know what that's done to my reputation? You humiliated yourself by refusing to pay a legitimate bill. Pay the judgment and we can both move on. I'll never pay you a single cent voluntarily, she said. If you want your money, you'll have to take it. Fine, I said. That's exactly what I'll do. I went back to the courthouse and obtained a wage garnishment order for Brenda and a bank levy for the HOA. The wage garnishment would take a percentage of Brenda's paycheck each month until the debt was paid, and the bank levy would freeze the HOA's bank account until they paid the judgment. When the HOA board members found out that their operating account had been frozen, they were furious. Not at Brenda initially, but at me. I received angry phone calls and emails accusing me of destroying the HOA and preventing them from paying for essential services like lawn care and pool maintenance. I responded to each one with the same message. I want a court judgment that Brenda and the HOA have refused to pay. This is a lawful collection action. If you want your account unfrozen, pay the judgment. It took about a week of pressure from other board members before Brenda finally caved. The HOA treasurer, a reasonable man named David Chen, who had been as frustrated with Brenda as I was, called me personally. "Vincent, we're going to pay the judgment," he said. "The board met last night and voted to pay it out of the operating account. Brenda voted against it, but she was outvoted 4-1. Can you release the levy once we pay?" "Absolutely," I said. "Have you considered removing Brenda as president?" David sighed. "We discussed it, but our bylaws make it difficult to remove an officer mid-term without cause. Being stubborn and making bad decisions isn't technically cause. She cost the HOA money by refusing to pay a $75 bill. Doesn't that count?" The lawyers say it's a gray area, but her term is up in 8 months, and I can promise you she won't be running unopposed this time. 2 days later, I received a check from the Maple Ridge HOA for $143. I deposited it immediately, half expecting it to bounce, but it cleared without issue. After nearly 4 months of fighting, I had finally been paid, but the saga wasn't quite over. At the next HOA meeting in July, which I attended out of morbid curiosity, Brenda announced during her president's report that she was proposing a new rule. Any homeowner who provided services to the HOA must do so as a volunteer, with no expectation of payment, because that's what being part of a community means. The proposal was met with stunned silence. Finally, Tom Richards stood up. "That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. If we need services, we should pay for them like any other organization. What you're proposing would open the HOA up to more lawsuits, not fewer." "I disagree," Brenda said coldly. "This neighborhood has become too litigious. We need to remember that we're neighbors first." "Neighbors pay their bills," someone else called out. The debate went on for 20 minutes before David Chen finally made a motion to table Brenda's proposal indefinitely. It passed 4-1, with only Brenda voting against. She looked around the room with barely concealed fury, and I realized that her power in the neighborhood had fundamentally shifted. People weren't afraid of her anymore. They had seen her lose, and that had broken the spell. After the meeting, several neighbors approached me to apologize for believing Brenda's version of events and for giving me the cold shoulder. I accepted their apologies graciously, though part of me was disappointed that it had taken a court judgment for them to see the truth. "You did us all a favor," one woman told me. She needed to be taken down a peg. As summer turned to fall, life in Maple Ridge slowly returned to normal. Brenda remained as HOA president, but she was noticeably quieter at meetings, her pronouncements less imperious. The board started making decisions without her input, and she seemed to realize that her authority had become largely ceremonial. In October, Tom Richards announced that he would be running for HOA president in the upcoming election. He asked if I would endorse him, and I happily agreed. We created a simple platform: transparency, fiscal responsibility, and treating all homeowners with respect. It wasn't revolutionary, but in the context of Brenda's reign, it felt like a breath of fresh air. The election was held in early December, and Tom won in a landslide, receiving 73% of the votes cast. Brenda, who ran for re-election despite everything, received just 12%. The rest went to a third candidate who nobody took seriously, but who apparently seemed better than Brenda to 15% of the neighborhood. At the final meeting of the year, Brenda gave a brief farewell speech that was heavy on grievance and light on grace. She talked about how she had given 6 years of her life to the neighborhood, only to be betrayed by people who didn't appreciate her sacrifices. She didn't mention me by name, but she didn't have to. Everyone knew what she was talking about. When she finished, there was polite applause that faded quickly. Tom took over as president, and the meeting continued with discussions of snow removal contracts for the upcoming winter. The county had been unreliable, Tom noted, and perhaps the HOA should budget for a private contractor to handle the neighborhood streets during major storms. Several people nodded in agreement. "I know a guy," Tom said with a grin, looking at me. I laughed. "I'll give you a quote." After the meeting, as people were filing out into the cold December night, Brenda approached me. I braced myself for another confrontation, but her demeanor was different. She looked tired and defeated. "I suppose you got what you wanted," she said. "I just wanted to be paid for work I did," I replied. "That's all I ever wanted. It was never about the money for me. It was about the principle, about people doing things for the community without expecting something in return. I do things for the community all the time, Brenda. I volunteer at the neighborhood cleanup days. I help my neighbors with their yards when they need it. But when someone asks me to provide a professional service, they should pay for it. That's not unreasonable." She was quiet for a moment. "Maybe not. But you didn't have to sue me. You could have just let it go. And you could have just paid me." She nodded slowly, then turned and walked away. I never spoke to her again after that night. She moved out of the neighborhood the following spring, selling her house to a young couple with 2 kids. Tom told me later that she had taken a job in Phoenix and wanted a fresh start. I did end up getting that contract to plow the neighborhood streets. Tom and the HOA board approved a fair rate, and we put everything in writing with a proper contract that specified when I would plow, how much I would be paid, and the payment terms. That first winter under the new arrangement, we got hit with 3 major snowstorms, and I plowed Oakmont Court and the other neighborhood streets without incident. The HOA paid every invoice within 15 days. Looking back on the whole experience, I learned some valuable lessons. I learned that standing up for yourself matters, even when the amount in dispute seems trivial. I learned that bullies like Brenda rely on people backing down, and when someone finally stands firm, their power evaporates. I learned that small claims court, while intimidating, is accessible and effective for ordinary people seeking justice. But mostly, I learned that community isn't about one person demanding that everyone else sacrifice for their benefit. It's about mutual respect, fair dealing, and honoring your commitments. Brenda never understood that, and it cost her everything she had tried to build in Maple Ridge. As for me, my business continued to thrive. The publicity from the lawsuit, oddly enough, brought me new clients who appreciated someone willing to stand up for fair payment. My reputation in the neighborhood improved, and I became known as someone who was both helpful and professional. Tom turned out to be an excellent HOA president. He ran the organization efficiently, communicated clearly with homeowners, and never once tried to bully anyone into doing anything. Under his leadership, Maple Ridge became the kind of community Brenda had always claimed she wanted it to be, but could never create through force and intimidation. And every time it snows, every time I attach that plow to my truck and head out into the pre-dawn darkness to clear the streets, I think about that January morning when Brenda called me demanding that I plow her street. I think about how a simple request for fair payment turned into a months-long legal battle. I think about how $75 became a matter of principle that changed an entire neighborhood. Sometimes, the smallest battles are the most important ones to fight. Not because of the money or the outcome, but because of what they reveal about character and integrity. Brenda demanded I plow her street. I did the work. She refused to pay, and I sued. It was that simple and that complicated. In the end, justice prevailed, as it often does when you're patient enough to see it through. The check I deposited that day in June was more than payment for snow removal services. It was validation that standing up for yourself matters, that contracts mean something, and that even the most intimidating opponent can be held accountable. That was worth far more than $143, though I was certainly happy to have the money too.